Anderson, South Carolina keeps its secrets the way the Piedmont keeps its red clay, pressed deep, stained permanent, impossible to wash clean. Drive through Anderson today, and you will pass a Waffle House and a Dollar General and a Baptist church with a marquee sign offering spiritual advice in cheerful white plastic letters. And if you are not paying attention, if you are just passing through on your way to somewhere the highway considers more important, you will miss what the land itself is trying to tell you. You will miss the way the soil underneath the strip malls and the subdivisions is the color of dried blood. You will miss the way the tree line at the edge of town holds a particular kind of stillness that is not peace, but something older and more complicated than peace. You will miss the fact that this quiet, unremarkable American city sits at the center of one of the most violent economic enterprises in the history of human civilization, and that the descendants of the people who were consumed by that enterprise still live here, still worship here, still carry, in their surnames, in their gestures, in the specific cadence of their English, in the very arrangement of their bones, the compressed residue of a history that nobody fully wrote down. One of those descendants was named Chadwick Aaron Boseman. And the story we are about to follow is not the story of a man who played a king. It is the story of a man who already was one and never fully knew it. Here is the thing about cotton that the history books treat as economics, but that is actually theology. Cotton does not care who plants it. The bowl opens the same way in the hand of a free man as it opens in the hand of someone who has been told, by law, by violence, by the entire administrative machinery of a Christian civilization, that he is not a man at all. The fiber inside is identical. The weight per bushel is identical. The price per pound on the Liverpool Commodities Exchange does not fluctuate based on the moral condition of the labor that produced it. Cotton, in this sense, was the perfect instrument of American slavery's central lie, that human difference was biological and fixed and legible in the body, because the body that the system claimed was inferior was producing, at extraordinary physical cost, the raw material that was making the system's architects extraordinarily wealthy. The upstate Piedmont of South Carolina was, by 1850, one of the most productive short-staple cotton regions in the world. This was not an accident of geography. It was an accident of violence, or rather, it was the entirely predictable result of a deliberate, systematic, multi-generational program of human kidnapping. The red clay soil of Anderson County could grow cotton. It required human hands to do it, and the people who supplied those hands were taken from a specific part of the world for reasons that had nothing to do with the random cruelty of individual bad actors and everything to do with the rational economic calculations of an empire. The ships came to a particular stretch of the West African coast. They came, with grinding historical regularity, to the place that European maritime charts labeled with a name that has always been its own indictment, the Slave Coast. They came for a specific people, and some of those people ended up in Anderson County, and their descendants included a boy who was born in 1976 and who would grow up to stand in front of a camera and, with a stillness that puzzled and moved audiences who could not quite articulate why it felt so ancient, so earned, so pre-existing, become a king. Start with the name. Always start with the name. Boseman. Say it out loud. Feel where it sits in the mouth. It is not an African name. There is no language in the Niger Delta, no dialect spoken along the banks of the Ogun River or in the market squares of the old Oyo Empire, in which Boseman means anything at all. It is, etymologically, a North Sea name, Dutch or Low German in its roots, built from syllables that belonged to a people who had never seen the red clay of South Carolina, and whose connection to this story is the particular damning connection of the perpetrator. The boss element refers to a thicket, a forest, a man of the bush. It arrived in the American South the way all the surnames on black bodies in the antebellum South arrived, not carried across an ocean in the memory of grandmothers, not inherited through the careful custodianship of a family line that understood names as sacred, but stamped, assigned, applied to a human being the way you apply a brand, to indicate ownership, to indicate transferability, to transform a person with a history into a commodity with a label. When Chadwick Boseman answered to his surname, he was, without knowing it or choosing it, answering to the name of the family that enslaved his ancestors. This is not a metaphor. This is American administrative history. This is what the records show when you pull them. But here is the genealogical investigator's first and most important discipline. Do not let the imposed name make you believe the original identity was erased. The name is a lock. The archive is a set of imperfect keys. And underneath the lock, underneath the imposed American identity, underneath the census categories and the slave schedule columns and the Freedmen's Bureau labor contracts with their fine print clauses about behavior and productivity, underneath all of it, there is a different story, a much older story. A story that was never written down because the people who controlled the writing instruments did not consider it worth recording. That is the story we are going after. The genealogical record for the Black Boseman families of Anderson County has a specific shape. It looks, from a distance, like any other African-American family tree in the Deep South, a trunk that is visible and documented from roughly 1870 onward, with branches that become increasingly specific and traceable as you move toward the present, and roots that, as you push backward, past the Civil War, past emancipation, past the legal boundary that separates American history into the era when black people were recorded as people, and the era when they were recorded as property. Those roots become shadows. They become suggestions. They become the genealogical equivalent of a word that has been deliberately smudged on a page, where you can see the shape of the letters but cannot read what they say. Chadwick Boseman's family stayed in Anderson County for generations. This is itself a significant data point. The Great Migration, that extraordinary decades-long northward movement of black Southerners fleeing Jim Crow and seeking industrial wages in Chicago and Detroit and New York, pulled millions of families up off the Southern soil in the first half of the 20th century. The Bosemans, or at least the branch of them from which Chadwick descended, were not among those who left. They stayed in the Piedmont. They stayed in the shadow of the same red clay fields that had held their ancestors in bondage. Leroy Boseman, Chadwick's father, ran an upholstery business in Anderson. His mother, Carolyn, was a nurse. The family was rooted in the black middle-class infrastructure of a mid-sized southern city. The church, the school, the local economy of skilled labor and professional service that black communities in the post-civil rights South had built with remarkable tenacity on top of the rubble of everything that had been systematically denied them. Chadwick was the youngest of 3 boys. He grew up in a house where education was not optional and where the black church was not merely a Sunday obligation, but a full cosmological framework, a way of understanding suffering and dignity and the relationship between the human present and something larger and more enduring than any individual life. This is worth noting because it is not incidental to who he became as an artist. The particular gravity that audiences noticed in his performances, the quality that critics reached for words like gravitas and presence to describe, always circling the real thing without quite landing on it, did not come from acting school. It came from a formation, a cultural formation that was itself the product of a specific history that runs, if you follow it backward far enough, all the way to the banks of a West African river. But we are not there yet. First, we have to get through the paper wall. The 1870 United States Federal Census is simultaneously one of the most important documents in African American history and one of the most heartbreaking. It is important because it is the first census to record formerly enslaved Black Americans as named individuals, to treat them, in the administrative language of the federal government, as people who existed, who had names and ages and places of birth and occupations and households. It is heartbreaking because of what that fact implies about every census that came before it. The 1860 census did not record enslaved people by name. Neither did the 1850 census, nor the 1840, nor any census before that. For the entire antebellum period of American history, the federal government's official mechanism for counting and categorizing its population treated enslaved Black people not as a subcategory of the human population, but as a category of livestock, enumerated separately in documents called slave schedules, where they appear as a sequence of data, age, sex, and a single letter indicating color. B for Black, M for mulatto. No name, no family relationship, no indication that this entry and the entry directly below it are a mother and her child, or a husband and wife, or two brothers who have spent every day of their lives within arm's reach of each other. When genealogical investigators trace the Boseman family backward into the 1860 slave schedule for Anderson County, South Carolina, this is what they find: a document that is physically ordinary and morally extraordinary. The paper has aged to the specific yellow-brown of old newspaper left in a sunny window. The ink, which was black when the census enumerator dipped his pen in 1860, has faded to a color that is somewhere between brown and rust. The color, if you want to be precise about it, of very old blood. The handwriting is careful, the letters well-formed, the columns straight. Whoever filled out this document took professional pride in its legibility. They were good at their job. Their job was to count human beings without acknowledging their humanity, and they did it neatly, column by column, page by page, county by county, until they had produced a comprehensive administrative portrait of a civilization built on the systematic dehumanization of millions of people, and it was all very orderly and well organized, and the penmanship was excellent. Find the entry for a white Boseman slaveholder in Anderson County. Run your finger down the column of ages. There are men listed here, women, children, some of them very young, some of them old enough that they were almost certainly born in Africa, or born to someone who was born in Africa, because the legal international slave trade ended in 1808, but the memory of it, the biological and cultural inheritance of it, was still present and living in 1860 in the bodies and minds of people who were now in their 50s and 60s and who remembered or had been told where the original crossing had begun. Somewhere in that column is an ancestor of Chadwick Boseman. We cannot say with certainty which entry it is. The document will not allow that certainty. That is precisely the point. That is precisely why the document was designed the way it was designed. Certainty of identity was a privilege reserved for the people whose names appeared at the top of the page. Everyone else got a number and a letter and an age estimate that the census enumerator guessed by looking at them. the way you might guess the age of a horse by examining its teeth. But the DNA does not care about what the census enumerator wrote down. The DNA was there in 1860, and it was there in 1760, and it was there before the first ship left the West African coast with its terrible cargo, and it has been accumulating its patient, precise, unalterable record of human lineage for tens of thousands of years, waiting for a moment in technological history when someone would develop the instruments to read it. That moment arrived, and what the instruments read, when they were applied to the Boseman lineage, was not what anyone had specifically predicted, and not what the Anderson County slave schedule could have told you, even if it had tried. The DNA points to the Yoruba, not broadly, not approximately, with the specificity of a needle finding true north after a long disorienting spin, the autosomal clustering, the mitochondrial haplogroup signature, the regional population modeling all converge on the same coordinates: southwestern Nigeria, the Yoruba heartland, the civilization that built bronze cities and mapped the heavens and codified a theology so internally coherent and so philosophically sophisticated that it survived the Middle Passage not as a relic, but as a living system, rebuilding itself in Cuba and Brazil and Haiti under different names but with the same bones. This is where the Boseman lineage originates. This is the kingdom that the slave schedule refused to name. And here is the thought that will not leave once it arrives. The Yoruba had a king who became God. His name was Shango. He was the Alafin of Oyo, the ruler, the warrior, the man of such overwhelming presence that after his death, the boundary between human and divine simply stopped being relevant to people who had known him. He became the Orisha of lightning, of thunder, of royal power and divine justice. His colors were red and white. His symbol was the double-headed axe. Across the diaspora, in every country where Yoruba people were taken and where they rebuilt their cosmology from memory, Shango survived. In Trinidad, in Cuba, in Brazil, in the Louisiana Bayou, in the coded spirituals of South Carolina's Gullah Coast, where his thunder moved underneath the Christian lyrics like a current beneath still water. Chadwick Boseman descended from the people who made Shango. He descended from the civilization that understood, at its theological core, that a king and a god were not always different things. That extraordinary human presence, pushed to its limit, could become something that outlasted the body carrying it. On August 28, 2020, Chadwick Boseman died. He had spent 4 years carrying a terminal diagnosis in private while publicly becoming the most recognizable image of Black royal dignity in the history of popular culture. He did not announce his illness. He did not slow down. He showed up again and again with that quality that nobody could quite name, that stillness, that weight, that sense of someone who knows exactly where he comes from and is therefore not afraid of where he is going. The ancestors who were recorded as tick marks in an 1860 ledger could not have imagined him, or perhaps they could. Perhaps that is exactly what you imagine when everything has been taken. You imagine someone someday standing in a light that the whole world can see, carrying something of yours inside him without knowing it, giving it back to everyone who lost it. He came from Oyo. He came from Ile-Ife. He came from the people who looked at lightning and saw a king. And the lightning, it turns out, was always his.